Okay, welcome to the community call. So before I dive in, is there anything, because this is all stuff that I've added, so I don't want to I might need to get a glass of water. Is there anything anybody else wants to discuss before we dive into some of these that they just haven't had a chance to put on the agenda? No. Okay. All right. First one, Gateway API V1 RC1. So that's released and available. We're starting to look at testing it with MGC. I took a look through the release notes. I don't see anything too impactful, but I could be wrong, or I could be misreading maybe part of the release notes. I didn't sort of spend hours reading through them. I just sort of skimmed through. So I guess the question is around service protection as well. I don't think it's going to just work with Istio, so I guess we have to wait for Istio to update, because I was sort of thinking to myself, could we just install the CRDs and Istio would just work with them? But I'm not sure that is the case, because it's moved from V1 beta 1 to V1, so that probably doesn't allow that to work. Anybody else got any view on this around Istio and Gateway API RC1? Yeah, Guy.
I haven't tested myself, Craig, but because usually when you install multiple versions of a CRD, only the latest version is kept, right? And for the others, it's expected to have a conversion webhook. It might still work with Istio, right? Because if it requests even if it requests a particular version, if I remember correctly, one thing that we had not been doing so far is installing Gateway API webhooks, right? I know it has at least one for validating webhook. Not so sure about conversion, but maybe so.
Okay.
Just saying that I think it's worth trying even before Istio announcing support for 1.0.
I agree, right? I think what's the worst that can happen? It doesn't work, right? So I think getting somebody to look at RC1 of Gateway API is a really good opportunity just to see if there's anything huge that's gonna hit us. It might be that it just doesn't work with Istio, and then we're kind of stuck. But if it does work, we get a jump ahead of actual V1 release, and that's what we're doing with MGC. It's a little bit different because we have no actual gateway provider. Technically, MGC is the gateway provider, I guess. So I think Laura's looking at that at the moment. So if you do, if somebody else looks at the service protection piece, you could sync with Laura or whoever's on that ticket around that installation and things. So, okay. So it sounds like +1 to let's give it a try on the service protection side as well. I would say it's relatively high priority as well. Like in my mind, at least trying it is quite high priority, because if getting that head start would mean that we can be fairly certain that Kuadrant will work with V1 of Gateway API, and we can be ready to, mention that we also support V1 once it's available. Okay. Let me just note. Separate policy controller. Yeah, so I started to think about separate policy controller. Separate policy controller, when I talk about that, what I really mean is the policy controller that's in the multi-cluster gateway controller at the moment. I'm not specifically talking about the Kuadrant operator yet. So we've already got a branch ready in case the POC needs it in order to provide DNS policy as a single cluster thing. So we've got a relatively simplistic approach, which is to use a flag to basically turn off all the OCM integration pieces. The code is fairly well structured at this point that none of it, or almost none of it, relies on OCM for the policy side of things. But as I was starting to put together, well, one thing is I wasn't sure if it's supposed to be an RFC or not. It doesn't really impact the customer, so I'm sort of thinking not. But yeah, kind of debating that in my head. The excuse me, sorry. So the thing that kind of led me towards with the proposal was how installation should work. So as we want it to work in a single cluster mode, it means that DNS policy and TLS policy will sit alongside auth policy and rate limit policy in the same cluster. And installation of Kuadrant is done by the Kuadrant operator. So one of the things that jumped to me and I wanted to sort of socialize with this group is what if we created a separate policy controller from the gateway controller. If we sucked in the manifests basically as part of the Kuadrant operator bundle, then it would mean that when you installed the Kuadrant operator, alongside it would come the, whatever we decide to name it, policy controller, and they would both be installed at the same time. And the Kuadrant operator wouldn't be responsible for managing that. It would just be there alongside the Kuadrant operator. Kuadrant operator would basically remain untouched. There would just be a new deployment running alongside it that would be taking care of DNS policy and TLS policy. I feel like that is the least heavy touch at this point. Like the other options would be to like create its own entirely own operator. I feel like that's a little bit heavyweight right now because I don't think we've decided longer term whether we want one single policy controller or we want many small policy controllers. So yeah, I'm going to throw that out there, and somebody, you know, shout at me if you hate that idea, or if you have a different idea.
But how much logic is required for a policy on the controller side? I guess it depends on the policy itself. So I'm wondering, like, how bulky would that controller get over time? Do we have an idea of how many policies are in our pipeline? That kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, so that's like, I think we could touch on that next, Dave, right? Like whether we want to have separate policy controllers versus a single policy controller. This piece is more about just taking the policy controller that already exists in the gateway controller and installing it alongside Kuadrant. That's kind of the first bit that I wanted to solve. And then we can probably talk a little bit more about whether we want a big policy controller or many small policy controllers after that. If that's okay, Dave, just follow up with that one.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
and maybe I moved on too quick. Yeah.
Well, I suppose we can wrap it up. Nobody is violently against that, so that's what I will proceed with for now. We'll go, Guy. Almost got there.
I'm sorry. Actually, what I have to say is connected to your next bullet point, which is the abstraction policies, right? And at the same time with this one, I don't know. But I've been playing with Meta Controller a while ago. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with that project, but it basically allows you implementing Kubernetes cluster controller in the same fashion that you would implement, for example, a conversion webhook, right? So you install some CRDs in the cluster that allows you to register a particular type of resource, Kubernetes resource that you want to watch for events related, and it will call your service, and your service is only expected to parse a JSON input and respond with the JSON output with either the same resource properly enhanced, or which is one of the use cases, or a set of child resources in the case of the composite controller, as it's called. And that made me think on a possible alternative for implementing the abstraction policies at first, right? Things such as, if you want to convert a let's say, JOT authentication policy into a more detailed quadrant auth policy, that could be a handy tool, to get that done. Alternatively, to the typical operator SDK QBuilder approach that we've been following for implementing custom controllers so far, right? And that idea took me to yet another one, which was of maybe one day having a kind of community controllers or community policies, a kind of repo where people from the community would be able to come up with their own kind of policies that basically just translate to Kuadrant policies. So they could write their own instructions. So I started thinking on that idea, and alternatively, again, of to having one big controller that watches for n kinds of different policies, right? And most of them, or quite a few of them, would only be about recreating other kinds of policies defined by Kuadrant itself, right? And I think it would allow us defining some more lightweight controllers, right? Custom controllers for those more specific kind of policies. Don't know if there's something there for DNS policy and TLS policy in the workload cluster or not, right? But in the spirit of maybe one day having, community repo where people share their own custom controllers for implementing things based on Kuadrant underneath, I don't know. Maybe there's something there that we can use.
It's an interesting idea. So what you're, if I understand correctly, Guy, you're saying that basically you define one policy, which might be, like you said, like a JWT auth policy, right? And underneath that, you have like the auth policy can handle that, right? So, but it's much more. It's more like a envoy filter root access type, right? So you write a conversion between JWT policy and auth policy, and basically when you create the JWT policy, it spits out the correct auth policy. Am I understanding that right?
That's right. Yeah, and it also works if you want to convert, for example, let's say, authenticated rate limit policy into not just one auth policy, but an auth policy plus a rate limit policy, right? So multiple child resources. And maybe for each one of those abstractions, you would implement your dedicated conversion service, right? Instead of having one big monolith that converts for all kinds of policies. So maybe you would have one service that you deploy only for converting JWT auth policy to Kuadrant auth policies, another one only for authenticated rate limited to auth policy plus rate limit policy. And if that's going to be a thing, right? If that's really something we would like to pursue, why not having one service for DNS policy, one service for the TLS policy? You know what I mean? Because I think what made me make the connection between those two bullet points in the agenda, when you mentioned either having multiple services or one single policy controller that takes care of all kinds of policies, right? I think we've been thinking on Kuadrant-defined policies, but what about policies that one day, I don't know, maybe defined by the community?
This is an interesting idea. Yeah, I think we should explore that a little bit further. Maybe we could do some kind of exploration of like I really like the idea of an authenticated rate limit policy, because that's like showing the power of it a little bit more, I would say. All right, so maybe we do some kind of exploration around what it would mean to create that type of policy and have it converted into an auth policy and a rate limit policy. And allow, so it's like allowing the user to express things in ways that they understand, rather than like necessary rate limit policy. What kind of rate limiting do I need to do? And I need to do authenticated rate limiting. And so I do see that as potentially a powerful option where even visually it makes it look like Kuadrant is actually doing a whole lot more for you than maybe you think it would be doing in its current form. If that makes sense. Dave, does that tie into your discussion point?
Yeah, it does. So I think what I'm hearing there is you'll end up with a separate controller for each policy type. Like, yeah, one for rate and one for auth, one for DNS, one potentially for TLS. At least that's kind of what I'm hearing. And then there's a separate thing that will convert some other number of smaller policies into what you actually need in that
Right.
superset.
Yeah, because so along the same lines, I was kind of asking myself some questions here around single versus multiple policy controllers, and I was thinking about the quadrant operator in the way that it's sort of it's covering multiple responsibilities, right? It's like installing components, it's offering a policy API, and it made me think: is there an opportunity for bringing like if we invested into the policy API machinery, right? Then like basically creating a set of small policy controllers that could be installed alongside like the rate alongside limitador, for instance, right? Now, maybe how you install that, maybe it's via the CRD that's already there. Maybe there's a separate CRD that you define and it will set up the policy controller, right? Then you kind of have this sort of something that we've talked about in the past, this kind of modularity, right? Where in the catalog you have rate limiting, which comes with rate limit policy, and then you have auth, which comes with auth policy. And you could imagine DNS and TLS is an interesting one. You could have DNS policy that just comes with the DNS controller for the multi-cluster, or you could have one that comes with external DNS, right? If when we had support for that you install that, you get the external DNS as well as part of that. And it gives you that kind of modularity around what policies you want to use and when. Yeah, so I think there's a bit of exploration there. So there's kind of two parts, I think. One is that idea that you talked about, Guy, which is, I would say, is separate from what I just mentioned, but you made me think, tie it into the point here, and exploring like the idea of being able to define one policy and then basically convert that into a set of policies. And the second thing then is probably to have a more focused discussion about like, should the policy controller sit alongside like limitador, for instance, right? The limiter operator should install the policy controller and make it available, because I guess the point of contention there is the WASM plugin, I guess, right? Because what installs that? Because like the policy controller itself is fairly innocuous and sort of very tightly coupled to limitador itself and the implementation it has. But we need something to actually configure the WASM plugin still. I said loads of stuff there.
Yeah, can you elaborate on the last bit, because that confused me what you said there, because I don't think this is the way this works. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So like in order for rate limit policy to be applied, does the WASM module needs to be installed in proxy, right?
Yes, installed and configured. Yes,
installed and configured. Yeah. So do we have a WASM module for auth policy and a WASM module for rate limit policy that's bundled as part of the policy controller, or is it something separate that is spanning those two? Do you get what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, I guess I do. Yeah, that's an open question, I guess.
Do we need another policy controller for another policy type, which is just a WASM policy, and that's like the base for the two of them? Something like that. It allows anyone to extend it. Yeah.
Well, I know that like Alex and others have talked about, like, if we talked about last week, right? If we could abstract away a whole bunch of the ABI stuff and just create like a policy, I don't know what to call it, like a policy delegation framework that is like the base WASM module, and then you put your custom piece like into that framework, that might make it a bit simpler to make it portable and have like one WASM plugin for the auth, one WASM plugin for regulation. I don't know. I'm not.
Well, we have two policies that would use WASM. So that sounds like a really good proof of concept for how, a point I have for a future community call, but is how do we make people developing policies, how do we make it easier for people developing policies? So if we could do it for two policies, be it some framework around WASM or whatever, that could be what we bring to the community and say, hey, use this, it could get you up and running with policies very quick.
So yes to everything you said, David, but I don't know. So, okay, I guess I'm just going to jump to a conclusion. I don't know that for sure it's desirable to have two independent WASM module, or let's say multiple WASM modules to do those things. There's I mean, I don't want to open that thing, but there are also many pros of having a single WASM module deployed in your envoy that can do stuff. You know, those things, as Guy used, right? The authenticated rate limit, right? There's many things that come together at that point, right? Including what to do in the case something is not being auth and whatever. So this is why I said, like, one, it needs to be deployed. Yes, that's one thing, but it also very importantly needs to be configured. Yeah. And this is where things really go hand in hand. Like, bunch of the work that Guy had put in this RFC actually, right, describes some of that, how we remap RLPv2, like what it means to the WASM plugin and how it then communicates with limits door, right? There is a shared bit of knowledge there. And then we can extend that shared bit of knowledge to Authorino and, like, well, let's say authentication in your auth policy, right? So anyways, not that it invalidates anything you said, Dave, right? But just for the application that we have today, like, there are some interesting questions to ask ourselves without delving into details, because they're going to be boring.
Okay. I'm not sure
What about coming at it?
This.
Yeah. What about coming at it from the other point of view, rather than technical? What's happening? What's the goal here? What is the desired outcome?
Are you asking everyone or me, Dave? Sorry.
Whoever cares to answer.
For me, the desired outcome is this ability to pick and choose policy and install it when you need it.
Yes, so that's for the people using it. And then there's another one I'm thinking of, which is people developing policies. How can they, in like less than an hour, take some sort of number, develop and deploy a policy of their own, you know?
Okay, so that's Guy's thing, right? So
kind of, but it's using existing stuff. But I mean, like, if we want to build up a community of different policies.
Okay, you know? So then, sorry, Dave. So the outcome, I think we talk about two different things, right? One is, like, where do we put our existing policies, and should they all belong in one controller or in, like, deployed alongside the enforcement points that are there, right? And I think that's worth quite a bit more discussion. The second thing is, like, how do we create a large catalog of policy, which I think is a combination of Guy's idea and Hiram's idea, right, from last week. So Guy's idea is take our powerful policies and create a subset, a sub policy of those, which may be a combination of two different policies in order to create a new policy. And Hiram's idea is, okay, we don't do any of what you want to do, so here are some execution points, and we'll configure the proxy to make sure that your stuff gets called on request and on response. And you get to do some logic, and we'll execute that in WASM for you. is what I think is those two should be powerful enough for most people to do most things.
Yeah, and I think the tie-in with number one is like our policies maybe shouldn't be any more special than a user developed policy. And so the way you install it and configure them should be the same way you install and configure the Kuadrant policies.
And I agree. I kind of like that. But then back to my point, I think we shouldn't conflate the one policy, one wasn't module thing.
Sure.
How we go
Okay.
about that, not that I know, but
Okay, so like I'm hearing a lot of interest in this. So like, where do we go next with some of this? But we've already talked. I've already got an action point here to create an issue around the idea we talked about last week. Guy, do you want to take an action to flesh out some form of investigation around this meta policy concept? I'm going to call it meta policy concept.
Yep, sure.
Okay. So I think those two things are at least a starting point, and we can then probably bring some of those ideas back to this call. I know we're all super busy with lots of things, but I think we should try to make some time to investigate these over the next few weeks at least, hopefully, and see what we learn from that, because I do think there's a lot of value in both of those things.
I think, and I know some of that started, but I think we may drop the ball on that one, let's say last couple of weeks, which is this gateway API machinery thing, and move like all the logic of the DAG stuff or not that Guy drove a session on 2 weeks ago, whatever. I think it would also be really nice to move forward, because I think that's going to tie a bunch of those things together.
I think like the gateway API policy machinery piece is like something that's valuable to the whole community, even if they're if you develop a policy, you can use this. And I think I'm going to call it the Hiram idea is also valuable to the whole community, because you could take this WASM module and use it. It's like a simpler way of achieving what you want to do potentially within a proxy. So I see like quite a bit of community value for both of those. It's just finding time and space to do all these things. So, okay, so we kind of talked about both of these things here. So let me just, so for installation, we're going to bundle the separated policy controller with the Kuadrant operator initially. Longer term, we'll have some discussions around where we want those policy controllers to live and how they should work. I don't need to rush into anything here, so we can take a bit of time to figure that out. And some policy stuff we talked about with Guy's idea and Him's idea. Rate limit policy and shared counters. Okay. So this kind of ties into the previous one as well, right? Because I created like these fake policies called global rate limit and local rate limit. But I guess one of the things that would be nice to be able to show is this idea of expressing that like a particular limit is a global limit or a local limit. And one way to do that is obviously to indicate whether you want the counter to be unique or shared, is the terminology that I've used. So I created an issue for that. In that, it kind of talks about setting that at a per limit level, but perhaps we could, first of all, do something a little bit more experimental via an annotation support on rate limit policy to allow you to dictate that every counter in that policy should be shared. And that, in theory, should allow us to then show, like if we have a shared store, that you can set up a policy that can give you global rate limiting, right, rather than local rate limiting. I'm sort of gone off that idea a little bit with the idea that Guy is talking about. And I don't know if we need to do that right now. But that's what that was about, is this idea of indicating the type of counter you want to use with your policy. Yeah, so maybe we'll put that one on pause for now, because I'm not sure if I think maybe we should explore the meta policy idea. Maybe that's the first one we do, right? Where you can set global rate limit rather than authenticated rate limit. Maybe we do global rate limit and local rate limit as like conversions into rate limit policy. And that's how we achieve this, right?
Makes sense to me. Maybe the first task that we'll come up with a list of candidates of abstraction policies. I'll make sure to put this one as the first one on the list.
Yeah. Okay. So
and just for me to understand, so what we're saying is you would have like global or local that gets transformed into a rate limit, but then the rate limit effectively expects some shared storage for limitador to use, and have what I call like a qualified counter per cluster in the case of local, and no qualified counter in the case of global. Right?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. That's everything on my list, because I was the only stuff in there. We can leave it there if we want, or is there anything else that needs to be discussed, or has anybody thought about anything additional while we've been talking? Oh, we got some stuff here from Dave. I don't want to go into all this other stuff as well right now. I've been talking for ages. Dave, go ahead.
The stuff added at the top, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think I'd like to wait till after KubeCon before we discuss this. Yeah. So post KubeCon stuff. But if you want to chat about anything KubeCon related now, you could. I don't think there's many talks coming up, the Gateway API focus, but there is a big one around the GA of Gateway API. So that's something to keep an eye out for. That's in 2 weeks' time. So yeah, if anyone else finds any other interesting talks, do share. The recordings might be a few weeks after, but we might be able to get some virtual passes in the meantime for KubeCon.
Cool. Okay. Anything else? All right, we got a bit of time back then. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Craig.
Cheers.